Welcome to another episode of ESG Chatbox. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Alyssa, Director in OCBC's Global Wholesale Banking Sustainability Office, who will be sharing more about the recently published Singapore-Asia Taxonomy and its implications. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alyssa.
Hi Shu Yi, thanks for having me.
Maybe we can start with explaining what the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy is and its objectives.
Sure. Perhaps let me first begin with the definition of the word taxonomy, which seems like a daunting word to digest. A taxonomy broadly means a type of classification system. So in this case, the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy, that's championed by the Green Finance Industry Task Force, or GFIT, is a classification system that aims to use science-based technical screening criteria to classify economic projects that are aligned with Singapore and the region's overall environmental objectives. So in this taxonomy, there are 5 main environmental objectives that the taxonomy aims to achieve, which are also aligned with the EU taxonomy. These 5 objectives are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, protecting healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, promoting resource resilience and circular economy, and lastly, pollution prevention and control. In this first version, the taxonomy only tackles the first environmental objective, which is climate change mitigation. This taxonomy is intended to be a dynamic document and will respond to change as the situation evolves globally. In time, the other 4 environmental objectives will be added in the future versions as well. What we have to bear in mind is that we cannot view this taxonomy as a static document. As you have probably observed over the last few years, the sustainable finance and investment market has been constantly evolving and developing pretty rapidly. And so the standards that have been set today will need to be constantly recalibrated to keep up with the latest international standards and practice.
I understand the taxonomy adopts a traffic light approach to its classification. Could you share with us more about this approach and its definitions?
Definitely. How the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy works is that it includes a list of project types with technical screening criteria that are classified as green, being environmentally sustainable, amber, meaning this is in transition, or red, which is ineligible or not environmentally sustainable. For example, if I pick the real estate sector as an example of the taxonomy in use, looking at the construction of new buildings in Singapore, if the building attains a BCA Gold Plus or Platinum certification, then this can be considered a green activity. For new buildings, there is no amber category because new buildings are at this point in time already green or can be environmentally sustainable. But for existing buildings that can be renovated or retrofitted, it can fall into the amber or transition category. If it can show a minimum of 30% reduction in emissions or energy consumption up to 2030, even if it cannot meet the Gold Plus standard. So in a nutshell, the focus for the amber category is that the asset or measure being undertaken has to show significant progress in transition and with a firm sunset date. By 2030, the project should either be reclassified as green if it manages to attain the necessary green standard at that time, or move to red if it's no longer eligible. So what this system is intended to serve as is a practical guidance for market participants such as corporates, financial institutions like ourselves, investment managers, regulators, and other stakeholders to identify and allocate capital to green and transition activities and projects more effectively. Okay, so now if we go into the broad aims of the taxonomy, there are generally 3 main aims. Number 1 is to create a consistent classification system. Number 2 is to provide a benchmark for green activities. And lastly, by setting a common standard of what is green, amber, or red, this will also protect all the stakeholders that are in this game against allegations of greenwashing. So with these aims in mind, this can help all the stakeholders within the ecosystem have more comfort and confidence in investing or engaging in green and transition projects.
With the publication of the taxonomy and its traffic light approach that aims to direct capital flows towards sustainable activities, what does this mean for OCBC and the work that your team does?
For OCBC, we welcome the taxonomy as it helps to provide clarity through a common language with the other stakeholders that we work with in defining what is green and transition financing, and helps us to optimize how we direct our capital to supporting our customers' decarbonization projects. Before the release of this taxonomy, because there's not been a national standard for what is considered green, this has made judgment across the board more subjective, where different banks may have differing views of what constitutes a green activity. So it's really useful to have this taxonomy on hand, as it introduces more objectivity and raises the bar in terms of what customers should be striving for to qualify as a green or amber activity, and also allows the banks to uphold these standards.
It's great to hear that the taxonomy allows for greater consistency among customers and banks on what comprises green or amber activities. OCBC released our net zero targets earlier this year. How does the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy tie in with OCBC's net zero targets and Singapore's national climate commitments?
As part of our commitment to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we have committed as a bank to reaching net zero in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. For a start, we have identified 6 priority sectors that are carbon intensive and material to our loan portfolio. These sectors are power, oil and gas, real estate, shipping, aviation, and steel. These sectors also dovetail with the 10 sectors that are covered in this first version of the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy. So we can see that the Singapore-Asian Taxonomy complements OCBC's own net zero commitments and allows us to direct our financing to support taxonomy-aligned green and transition activities. This is with the ultimate aim of helping our customers meet their own net zero ambitions and commitments. For example, in the power sector, we can now use the taxonomy as a lens to see how we can support the retrofit of a gas power plant in Singapore and the level of ambition that is needed from our customers. For power projects, these are also usually very large scale and may require multiple banks syndicating the loan. So this taxonomy helps to set a common quantitative standard so that more financing can be extended to support this transition. On a more macro level, the taxonomy also helps to identify opportunities to support the activities that can help achieve the targets that we have under Singapore's Green Plan 2030.
You also mentioned that the taxonomy's objectives are aligned with the EU taxonomy. How is the Singapore-Asia taxonomy and its approach then compatible with other taxonomies like the EU taxonomy and the ASEAN taxonomy?
The criteria that are developed in the taxonomy reference the latest Singapore, ASEAN, EU, and international thinking. The taxonomy is intended to be generally interoperable with the other major taxonomies, but some aspects may be tweaked to be relevant to Singapore only. So for example, in Singapore, we will need to rely on natural gas for more than half of our power generation needs by 2035. Whereas in Europe is increasingly relying on renewables, with more than 70% in renewable power generation expected in the energy mix by 2035, according to the Energy Research Lab LNEG. It's also generally interoperable with the ASEAN taxonomy, but with the caveat that the ASEAN taxonomy is multi-tiered to facilitate the transition of the different ASEAN member states, which takes into account that each member state is at a different point of their own decarbonization journey and may have country-specific considerations that need to be factored in. But generally, with all these inputs in mind, it is the intention that this taxonomy can be used by stakeholders not just in Singapore, but regionally as well as globally.
So looking ahead into the future, what are some downstream initiatives or trends that we can expect from the release of the SG taxonomy?
Okay, let me break this down into the possible trends or initiatives that we can expect to see for different stakeholders, namely the regulators, the investors, the banks, and the actual businesses. Firstly, on the regulatory front, with the Singapore-Asian taxonomy, we do expect that this will provide more consistency in reporting. For now, as an example, banks define green activities according to their own taxonomies, so saying that a bank has 100 billion in green loans may mean different things for different banks, depending on how they have defined their own thresholds. So standardizing this through the Singapore-Asia taxonomy allows for a national understanding of what is a green or an amber activity and makes it easier for each party in the ecosystem to make the right decisions. For investors, we also expect that this will make for easier evaluation of a green investment, as it will be quite black and white as to whether it is Singapore taxonomy aligned or not. If it is, investor can be comforted that this is a high-quality green or transition investment. This taxonomy also helps to protect against any greenwashing allegations, which can channel more capital towards investments in taxonomy-aligned projects, which can then help to accelerate the green agenda in Singapore. On the bank side, we also expect that there will be more alignment between all the banks in Singapore or Singapore-headquartered banks that are operating globally in the definition of eligible green and transition projects. Another benefit that I see is that the taxonomy also encourages banks like ours to develop new solutions for credible green products that are taxonomy aligned that can be rolled out for our customers. And on the corporate side, because the taxonomy gives companies a clear direction of what is needed through a science-based framework, it should also incentivize companies to start designing their sustainability agenda according to the taxonomy, which has been set at quite a credible standard so that they can access financing for these actions more easily. All in all, I do think the taxonomy is a step in the right direction for promoting sustainable finance and investments in Singapore and helps to set the stage for quicker progress in reaching Singapore's net zero goals.
It sounds like stakeholders have much to look forward to with the publication of the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy, as its science-based framework can transform the industry in directing capital towards green and transition activities with a more consistent approach, as well as reduce greenwashing risks in the industry. Thanks, Alyssa, for taking the time to educate us on the Singapore-Asia Taxonomy and its approach, what it means for OCBC and Singapore, its alignment with other major taxonomies, and what different stakeholders can expect in the future.
It is indeed an exciting time for Singapore, and we hope to see more progress on the sustainable financing front so that we can accelerate the journey to net zero. Thank you once again, Shu Yi, for having me.